Today we're going to talk about genetically modified organisms throughout the United States. We'll start with what a genetically modified organism is. Genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are plants or animals whose genetic makeup has been transformed by recombinant DNA technology, which has new features such as resistance to herbicides, viruses, and insects. Genetically modified organisms were first created to speed up the food growing process and productivity. These new types of foods were first introduced to the international marketplace back in 1990. Now, in 2019, more than 50% of corn, soybeans, canola, and canola produced in the United States is genetically modified. So, how are people supposed to know what foods have GMOs? Basically, any food could contain GMOs or an amount of GMOs. Examples of foods and plants and animals that contain GMOs: chickens, potatoes, peas, corn, papaya, pigs, and cotton. So, if people want to know what is in their food, a label is required to be put on that package to determine whether or not that food does contain GMOs. In recent years, the FDA has actually began to require foods containing genetically modified organisms over a specific threshold to be labeled accordingly. The labels are not required to be printed on the package, but can be in the form of an electronic link, such as a QR code that can be scanned. The FDA was not willing to require labels for a very long time. They were not willing to budge against their long-held policies about genetically modified foods not being labeled. Eventually, the FDA did decide that genetically modified foods must be labeled only if they differ significantly from their conventional counterparts in the way that might pose a risk to the consumer. An example that they gave was a GMO tomato with a peanut protein. In this case, consumers that are allergic to proteins may not expect tomatoes to contain peanut protein, exposing them to a risk of consuming allergies. GMOs, in this case, may be harmful. In general, are genetically modified organisms harmful for human consumption? The impact of genetically modified organisms in human health is actually still being studied and has yet to be determined. But the FDA seems to believe that genetically modified organisms are not very harmful to human consumption. As they stated, they have no basis for concluding that bioengineered foods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way, or that as a class, foods developed by new technologies present any different or greater safety concern than foods developed by traditional plant breeding. This brings up an important distinction. Genetically modified foods, plants, and animals are not something that can occur in nature. The traits that they exhibit cannot be bred for. Plant and animal breeding is not the same as a genetically modified plant or animal. So, what research has been done to prove or disprove that what the FDA claimed about genetically modified organisms being harmful for human consumption has been done? There is actually a serious lack of research to prove or disprove whether or not GMOs are harmful for human consumption. People are not willing to be GMO guinea pigs because they are afraid of what might result. Recently, Casey Mantney, one of UAF's research professors, did a study on rats. He fed them genetically modified potatoes, and he fed some rats genetically modified potatoes and some rats normal potatoes. What he found was that the reproductive organs, livers, kidneys, and spleen showed no difference between genetically modified eating and non-genetically modified eating animals. But Mantney needed to delve further into the genetically modified organism issue to be able to fully prove or disprove that genetically modified organisms are or are not harmful. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned something new about genetically modified organisms today.